This video, we're going to see how the analyzer can be used to extract data from rent rolls and T12s that come in other commonly used formats. For the rent roll, I'm going to open this version of the rent roll up and show you a format that we commonly see where there are multiple lines per unit, and each unit has multiple charge codes and associated charges. In this case, we want to only analyze the rent for this property, and so we want to only extract those charge codes that either represent rents or subsidies, where subsidy in this case shows a Section 8 subsidy. We want to avoid charge codes like pet rent, which will show up in other income in the T12 statement. And then we'll also take a look at a non-standard T12 where the line item descriptors are indented past the first column. So we want to be able to read this data, and if you recall, the analyzer requires the line item descriptor to be in the first column followed by 12 columns of data. So with that, we will go ahead and open the copy of the analyzer that I've created in this directory, and this should be familiar to you from the previous video. And so we will now use the same fetch tab to retrieve the data in the rent roll that we just looked at. So first step is to select the rent roll, and that is kept in this directory that I just showed you, the same rent roll that we just looked at. It's a multi-line rent roll. And then the tab that contains the data is called Report 1. The sheet that we want to create in the current workbook is called RR with multi-lines, is what the mnemonic here represents. So it's going to create a tab with that name. And then instead of setting the next parameter to no, we're going to set it to yes. And if you recall, these parameters here then come into play. So in the rent roll, which I'll open up again, so we can have it open and refer to it easily, the first line of data is in line 3. So we'll put line 3 as the first line that we want to start processing. And then we want to terminate when we hit this termination string, which if you look at the rent roll once again, if you scroll all the way down to the end of the data, you'll notice that the termination string here is future residents / applicants. So we don't want to process data past this point. We only want to process data above this line. If there is no termination string, you can put whatever termination string you want. If you want to put 3x's, you can do that, and then make sure you put that same termination string in the analyzer. Then we want to indicate the column that contains the charge codes, and the charge codes in this rent roll are in column G, and the charges themselves are in column H. So we will put G for the charge codes and H for the charge amounts. And then finally, in this line, we want to put all of the charge codes that we want to aggregate. If you recall, we want to aggregate only the rent and the subsidies. So we put those charge codes here, rent and subsidy, and that has to match exactly the charge codes as they're listed in this rent roll. So we saw subsidy, we saw rent earlier, so we need to type that in exactly. Different rent rolls use different charge codes, so don't rely on the same codes to work on every rent roll. Make sure you look at the rent roll and extract the charge code that you want to use. So we've got to enter those two charge codes into the analyzer. So I'm going to go ahead and close the rent roll, and then we will run this code now. So it takes a second to run. It does its processing, and then it creates this new tab, which is the tab that we wanted. And you'll note now that there's now one line per unit, and there's only one charge code, which is the rent, which now represents an aggregation of rent and subsidy if there is one. So we can now look at this unit again. In the original rent roll, you'll note that it has a rent of $224 and a subsidy of $431. Together that adds up to $655. And you'll note now that this unit has a rent amount of $655. So it's been aggregated, and you can now run this through this normal analysis that we looked at in the previous video without any further pre-processing required. Let's now switch our focus over to the T12. And as prior, we will select the file that contains the T12, in which case I'm going to select the T12 that had the indentation in it. In that T12, the sheet containing the data is simply called sheet. So I'll just enter that here. And then the sheet that we want to copy the data into in the current workbook, we'll call it IND-T12 or Indented T12. And then we're going to once again set this parameter to yes. Previously we had it no, now we have it as yes, so that these three parameters come into play. Once again, like in the T12, there's a termination string, which is essentially the last row of the T12. We want to extract the string from there so that the code knows when to stop looking any further. So in this case, the last row contains the string net income. So we'll go ahead and put net income as a string there. And then we want to enter the columns for the code to scan. And by the columns for the code to scan, I mean the columns that contain the various charge code descriptors. You can see that the columns are A, B, C, D, and E. And we want to scan only columns B through E because it's going to scan those columns. If it finds a code, copy it to column A. If it's in column A, it leaves it there. Otherwise, it copies over to column A and deletes these columns once it's finished scanning. So we will go ahead and enter that as the column to start scanning as column B and the column to stop scanning as column E. With that, I'll go ahead and close the T12 and then run this code. We'll take a second and it's done. And then we go over to the tab that contains this new T12 and you'll note that all of the charge code descriptors have been moved to the first column and the additional columns have been deleted before the actual numbers show up. So there'll be 12 columns of numbers preceded by the line item descriptor. And then this can then be processed as before in the financial analyzer. Thank you. And if you have any comments or questions, please send me an email or enter it in the comments below. Thank you.